Is there a human who is responsible and accountable for the decisions being made? And are we holding that person responsible to the laws of war? It's very hard to set red lines in AI in advance and then hold them. Both companies, OpenAI and Anthropic, have both said that they think it's appropriate and it's reasonable to want to use AI for autonomous weapons. The question is the AI we have now ready? And what specific ways are you building AI into that whole kind of autonomous weapons system?
Do you trust Sam Altman to do the right thing here?
AI safety in war is no longer a theory. It is colliding with real conflict. Anthropic is now in court fighting the Pentagon after refusing to ease limits on autonomous weapons and mass surveillance, even as OpenAI moves deeper into classified US government work.
And with the Pentagon widening its investigation into the strike on a girls' school in Minab during the US-Iran war that killed around 170 people, there are questions about whether AI was used in making targeting decisions. AI is entering warfare. In fact, to some extent, it's already there, not just in terms of autonomous weapons or surveillance, but also in the planning in the offices of militaries worldwide. But questions remain about who's accountable when things go wrong.
To understand what's going on here, it's really important to go back to a 2018 dispute between the Pentagon and Google. So this was over something called Project Maven, one of the first AI projects that the Department of Defense, now renamed Department of War, one of their first AI projects. And Google was partnering with them on that. But then there was a big employee walkout, a lot of employee objections to what was being perceived as AI being used to help make targeting decisions based on overhead imagery. In that case, it was sort of analyzing images. And Google did not renew their contract. They didn't withdraw from the contract, but they didn't renew it. This was a really foundational moment for a lot of people in the defense tech space, and quite a radicalizing moment for many people. I think they were really distressed that an American company would not want to support the American military in work that they saw as sort of valuable and patriotic and helping secure, the country and the world. And so that is really important backdrop for what happened with Anthropic and for the government's stance, which I think in many ways is a reasonable stance, which is that they should be able to use technology that they're contracting with for any lawful purposes. The piece that's a little bit challenging or a little bit more complicated here is that the government had actually already signed a contract with Anthropic that included the guardrails that Anthropic wanted. But then somehow something happened. It seems like there was some kind of dust up over the course of sort of roughly January, where there was some misunderstandings or there were some tensions between the two parties. And the government went back to Anthropic and said, we actually want to change the contract. We want to get rid of all these guardrails. And that was where things fell apart, where Anthropic wasn't willing to go in and change the contract. But from, I think, the Pentagon's perspective, that was, a replay of this Google from 2018 of, the company not being willing to just sort of support them the way they wanted to be supported. So I think that is where things fell apart. And that is why when OpenAI came in and sort of initially seemed to be trying to hold the same guardrails, but then later on, it seems like in practice, it's really going to be that all lawful use standard that the Pentagon wanted. That is how we ended up there.
Okay, and we'll dive into the details of lawful use and what does that mean, and that's controversial in itself in a second. But just to stay with Anthropic, so if the US government can defend Anthropic's blacklisting in court as a lawful national security choice, what message does that send to every AI company that's thinking of drawing strict red lines?
Right, so this blacklisting, this supply chain risk designation, is the part here that is really, I would say, excessive and certainly exceptional. So the government deciding to end their contract with Anthropic and contract with a different vendor instead, perfectly reasonable, perfectly within their rights if they couldn't agree on contract terms. But the fact they've come in here and tried to declare Anthropic a supply chain risk, try to prevent any contractor that is working with the military from using Anthropic products in their work is a really disproportionate. It's unprecedented. It's the first time this designation has been used for an American company. It looks like they're going to have a hard time in court. The legal analyses that I've seen make it look like it's going to be very difficult for the government to defend that Anthropic is the level of threat that it needs to be in order to justify one of these designations, or that I think at least one of they've done two separate designations under two separate legal authorities. I think under at least one of them, they're required to try to do the least disruptive thing first before going all the way to a supply chain risk designation. So it's going to be very hard for the government to have a leg to stand on there. But I think even the threat, even the fact that Anthropic now has to go through the exercise of defending this in front of a court, and having a number of their major partners wanting to pull back on contracts or stop using Anthropic in certain places, that is already a problem for Anthropic, and is certainly going to have a chilling effect on the rest of the industry. And it's really important to emphasize here as well, Anthropic was very proactive and very early in going to work with the government. So in effect, they're being punished for being proactive, which is not really going to set the right incentives for other AI companies in the space.
I'm wondering, is it the use of AI or the lack of human oversight, like a human manager that then looks at the results and confirms the results? Is that the problem?
I think the key thing here, actually, I think people hear think of the idea of autonomous weapons, and that sounds very scary. But I think if you actually look at how the military does this work in practice, there are versions of autonomous weapons that are actually perfectly fine and actually we've been using for decades, and we know how to use them responsibly. And there are versions of kind of more AI-based ways of working in war that aren't autonomous, but that could be really, really concerning, even though they're not autonomous. So I sometimes think we get too focused on this sort of autonomy, not autonomy. Is the AI making the decision? Is the human making the decision? Versus looking at however the force is being used, is there a human who is responsible and accountable for the decisions being made? And are we holding that person responsible to the laws of war, to distinguishing between combatants and civilians, to proportionality? These are very old, very foundational principles in international humanitarian law, also known as the laws of war, laws of armed conflict. And so we've seen it. So I think that is really the question to be pushing on. And actually, both companies, OpenAI and Anthropic, have both said that they think it's appropriate and it's reasonable to want to use AI for autonomous weapons. The question is the AI we have now ready, and what specific ways are you building the AI into that whole kind of autonomous weapons system? As opposed to, I think the two companies are not as far apart as maybe it's been portrayed in some places in terms of their perception of what is acceptable.
So from your experience at OpenAI, how are these kinds of red lines decided? And can a company like that even be verifiably sure that the customer is sticking to the red lines?
Yeah, so I can't speak about this from my experience at the company specifically, but looking kind of across the industry, one thing that I think we're seeing over and over again is that it's very hard to set red lines in AI in advance and then hold them. This isn't actually the only the sort of autonomous weapons questions or domestic surveillance, which is also a really important part of this dispute. These aren't the only red lines that the industry is trying to set. There have also been, actually the very same week that Anthropic was sort of in the height of its fight with the Pentagon, they pulled back on one of their commitments in an unrelated domain about testing their systems for certain kinds of risks like how good are they at cyber offense, so hacking, how good are they at kind of autonomously going out and carrying out things that might make it harder for humans to control the AI. Anthropic had some commitments around if they reach certain points, and they would hold back on developing, they would slow down their research. And actually just a couple of weeks ago, they pulled back on those commitments. So I think there's a story across the AI industry right now of the people building the technology can tell that it's getting very powerful, that it's getting potentially risky. But every time they try and say, well, if we reach this point, that's where we'll have to rethink, reconsider. They tend to come back later and sort of revise and say, well, actually, that's maybe not quite the right red line. Maybe it's a little more fuzzy, a little more complicated, which doesn't exactly, it is complicated. Usually their decisions are defensible, but it doesn't exactly fill you with confidence as the technology is moving so fast.
I mean, there's been a lot of discussion about whether AI can be used for things like domestic surveillance, what falls under the lawful description. But do you think that there's a broader rejection among the public of the use of AI in general for these kinds of defense purposes, that there is something deeply unsettling about an AI being relied on for decisions which could mean that certain people live or die, regardless of where they are in the world, and that is an issue which just simply cannot be reconciled?
Yes, I definitely think there's a lot of reticence and fear in the public about this. I do think that it's important to distinguish between, I think that however these decisions are being made, there's sort of underlying foundational principles that are what we need to focus on. So things like, do you have recourse if a decision is made about you? Are you living in a rule of law society where you can come back and you can go to a court and argue for your side. I think if those things are in place, then I think the sort of specific mechanics of which decisions are being made in which ways, it doesn't matter quite so much. The challenge is if you have, a huge problem is if people treat AI as infallible and they say, oh, this is a computer, so it's objective, so it can't make mistakes or it can't be biased. We know that that's wrong. AI makes mistakes all the time. AI is biased all the time. So yes, I think the public is really not excited about this and has a lot of legitimate concerns. And at the same time, I think that the best way to handle those concerns is to go back to sort of basic questions of, okay, when something goes wrong, who's held accountable? If you're affected in a way that you shouldn't be, what are your options? Things like that.
Helen, I know we have to let you go soon. So last question, do you trust Sam Altman to do the right thing here?
I think I've said what I need to say on that topic. Happy to point you to other podcasts on that.
You've been watching a sneak preview of our business podcast, The Dip, where we follow money stories that cross borders.
And if you want more, you can scan the QR code that's appearing on your screen right now.